Good afternoon, I'm Rose Gill, and I'm a principal at Bloomberg Associates, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Federal Assistance E311 workshop on the Capital Projects Fund, which is part of the ARPA legislation administered by Treasury. We're looking forward to discussing projects supported by the CPF funding with an emphasis on broadband and to discussing what cities can be doing now. So just a quick set of housekeeping items. We want to make this as interactive as possible, as we always do. So please introduce yourselves now in the chat, as some of you have already done. Give us your name, your title, and if possible, your role as it relates to the funding. If it's possible to keep your cameras on, we'd love to see you, although mute yourselves so we don't have competition for our speakers. Please feel free to use the chat throughout the program. Give us your questions, your ideas, your thoughts, things that you're doing that are innovative that you would like to share. And our moderator will lift all the questions up during the Q&A session, and our speaker will answer them for you. We'd also like to invite anybody during the QA session who would like to come on camera and ask a question and have it be a little bit more colloquy is, of course, invited to do that, and you would just unmute and let us know that you want to jump in. All of the resources that we're going to share today, both the speakers and anything that gets posted ad hoc in the chat, will be shared with you after the workshop and posted on our E311 workshop website, so nobody has to worry about scrambling to get things now during the session. And today's workshop is part of an ongoing partnership that we have with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We've been helping cities manage, navigate, and retain COVID response and recovery funding for the last couple of years together. And I'd like to recognize and thank Tom Cochran, Dave Gatton, Laura Waxman, and David Burns, our partners at the USCM, for their invaluable collaboration and support and friendship. Together through this program, cities have had a place to go to have questions answered about the federal funding by the program's subject matter experts, one of whom you'll hear from today. Over the course of the past 2 years, our program experts have provided over 400 answers to city questions, many of which have been posted on our E311 website for all cities to access. And we've also done 14 or so deep dive workshops like this one on topics that are pressing or important. And our workshops have ranged on topics pertaining to housing, transportation, resiliency programs, grant writing, compliance reporting, and deadlines. And so those are also posted on the E311 website if anybody wants to go back on any of those topics. But all in, over 5,100 municipal staff from almost 1,300 cities have engaged with this program. And so we're so delighted that we're continuing with this and that you're here with us today. And this work that we're doing is now part of the local infrastructure hub that was announced with our partners in July of 2022, which is helping cities access the federal infrastructure funding. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jamie Lavin at Bloomberg Philanthropies, who will moderate and introduce our terrific speaker from Witt O'Brien. Jamie?
Thank you, Rose. And thank you all so much for joining today. We're excited for this dialogue. We've been having a lot of conversations about the various funds that are available to cities, whether directly from the federal government or through the states. And we think it's just so important to have a landscape view of where that capital can be stacked against one another to make real differences in your communities. And so we're excited to have Matt on today. Matt Hansen, who's an associate managing director at Witt O'Brien, has really been one of our go-to experts throughout this program and has been providing assistance in a range of topics on federal grants administration, from how to apply for and obtain the funds to how to administer those and properly report on those. As you can see here, Matt has significant experience at the state, federal, and local levels. So he really understands the intersection, and for programs like the Capital Projects Fund, understands that the cities need to be working with their states, and so how to do that most effectively. So now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Matt.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Bloomberg for this forum to get this critical information out to local government practitioners. The American Rescue Plan Act and Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Relief Fund have unfortunately become synonymous. People refer to ARPA and Fiscal Relief Fund in the same breath. ARPA, as I'm sure many of you know, actually contained numerous other programs, with the Capital Projects Fund being a critical funding opportunity included in the ARPA legislation, and unfortunately is being overlooked by many states and local jurisdictions. While local jurisdictions are not directly eligible to apply to the US Treasury for this funding, much of this funding will be passed through the states to local governments and service providers. And that is why it's so important for you to have this information. Local governments are currently making decisions about how to invest their local fiscal relief funds for broadband related projects, and also pursuing infrastructure investment and Job Act opportunities. But CPF is another viable option for broadband projects that you need to be aware of. On this slide that's showing now, the Capital Projects Fund was allocated $10 billion. That's billion with a B. I know we've all become very jaded about the dollar amounts that are out there right now with the COVID and IIJA and Inflation Reduction Act. But that is a significant amount of money, which is directed to be passed through to local governments and service providers. Each state is entitled to a minimum allocation of $100 million. So regardless of what state you're in, your state is starting with $100 million and going up from there based on population and some other factors. So we're talking about significant funding flowing into your state that has the potential to eventually flow down to your local community. As local government leaders, you are all very accustomed to following the flow of money from the federal government to your state agencies and eventually your community as a pass-through recipient. Because the Capital Projects Fund is a brand new program, there has not been as much information circulating about this program as, say, the programs in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Some states have already started to sub-allocate funding, while others are just now soliciting input from stakeholders on how to spend the funding. So regardless of what state you're in, at the end of the presentation, we will give you a list of to-do items. But now is the time to take action on trying to secure part of the Capital Projects Fund. Next slide. So from the beginning, the name of the Capital Projects Fund has been misleading. When the Local Fiscal Relief Fund guidance was issued and limited infrastructure projects to water, sewer, stormwater, and broadband, many people thought at the time that the CPF funding would be the funding available for other types of regular infrastructure projects. That, in fact, was not the case. CPF is primarily dedicated to broadband projects, as you will see, but there are some other potential uses that your jurisdiction should be aware of. Next slide. So the following projects are presumptively eligible by Treasury in their guidance. So broadband infrastructure, whether that be backhaul, long haul, middle mile, last mile, you name it, is allowable. Digital connectivity type projects, including devices. But an odd or somewhat odd item is this multi-purpose community facilities. What is intended or what is referenced by multi-purpose community facilities are community anchor institutions that provide job training, educational support, and healthcare screening. So as you can imagine, for your local governments, that could be libraries, it could be community centers, it could be community college programs, So quite a bit of flexibility within that third item, and not one that's getting a lot of news or a lot of press about the allowable use. There's also a fourth category, which is on a case-by-case basis. That's about as extensive as the guidance is. But if you have an innovative approach about how you could use technology to engage your local community, and it doesn't fit into one of these three buckets, certainly that's an option you should discuss with your state and ultimately the state with Treasury. What is woven into all of these programmatic activities, though, is the concept of affordable and reliable access to broadband technology. So there are requirements for folks who participate in this program to offer affordable access and to participate with many of the affordable programs that are out there right now. So it is not just about access, it's also about affordable and reliable access to broadband technology. Next slide. So while there's no specific deadline for local governments right now, your state counterparts are approaching critical deadlines related to this program. We'll go through a timeline in a minute, but this is really why we wanted to make this information available to you right now, so that you can use this opportunity to advocate on behalf of your projects, general project types, specific programs, or your local community in general. And for those states that have already started to suballocate funding, that you're aware of those pass-through opportunities and you're taking advantage of them. Next slide. So as you all know by now, the U.S. Department of Treasury is a non-traditional federal grant-making agency and has relatively limited staff capacity to implement and manage new programs. They are rapidly building that capacity, but they certainly came in at a deficit. Much of their focus early on was with the establishment of the Fiscal Relief Fund program and the closeout of the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund. Thus, the implementation of the Capital Projects Fund was significantly delayed. As you will see on this timeline, the initial guidance was finally issued in November of last year. States had a deadline to secure their allocation in December. Every state has in fact done so. Every state has signed up to receive their portion of the Capital Projects Fund. The first planning and admin funds were made available in January of this year to states. So that's really when states kicked off, much of their stakeholder engagement and project development work. But the current deadline that I was alluding to on the earlier slides is the September deadline to submit grant and program plans by the states. Many states have already done this. Some have already received approval, but others are actively working through this process, developing their grant plans and program plans and soliciting stakeholder input. And this is why it's so critical for you all to have this information and being engaged with your state counterparts to make sure your priorities, your needs are built into the state's grant plan. Treasury is approving these grant plans and program plans on a rolling basis, with some already approved, which we will highlight on a future slide, but the bulk of them are yet to be approved, as you'll see. Generally speaking, the Capital Projects Fund follows the same timeline as the fiscal relief funds, with obligations required to be made by December 31st, 2024, and expenditures completed by December 31st, 2026. This is important to keep in mind if you look at braiding Capital Projects Fund money with your ARPA funding, that both pots of money are on the same timeline and should be make easier from a management perspective. The key takeaway from this slide is that your state has, if your state has already submitted their grant and program plans, you should be on the lookout for pass-through grant opportunities. Or if your state is still finalizing their grant and program plans, you should be reaching out to the State Office of Broadband or whomever is responsible for this funding to help influence those plans. So really want to drive the message home that now is the time to take action, not down the road when
This is she.
When the pass-through funding opportunity is ultimately released by the state, but now is really your opportunity to take action and get ahead of this program. Next slide. Again, while local governments are not eligible to apply directly to Treasury, it is important for you to know what the program requirements are so that you can start to identify potential projects that might be eligible. One of the most important parts of building grants management capacity and organizational calm is having as much advanced planning as possible. One of the key recommendations I would make is to be reviewing information as soon as it's available, even if it's not the final pass-through guidance that your state ultimately issues. We hear this time and time again from local governments that by the time they learned about a program at a conference or from their state agency, they only had a limited number of weeks to try to identify a project and develop an application. Here's your opportunity to get ahead of it and really start thinking through the process well in advance of when you ultimately have to submit an application. Next slide. So for the states, there are two parts to the submission to Treasury. The first part is what they call a grant plan, which is a high-level executive summary. It includes an allocation table to identify different initiatives. So at very high levels, we're going to spend a third of the money on middle mile, a third of the mile on devices. It's at that level of detail. And the grant plan must have at least one completed program plan. So the grant plan can talk about lots of different programs, lots of different projects. Those don't have to be fully completed at this point, but they have to have at least one done. As an example, the state of Kansas grant plan includes 3 programs. They've only finalized 2 of them. The third is still out there pending. The program plan, on the other hand, is the specific details where the program narrative and budgets are reviewed and actually negotiated with Treasury. Unlike the fiscal recovery funds, where Treasury said that they were not going to review allowable uses, they were not going to give you prior approval, Treasury is in fact doing that with individual projects and programs under the Capital Projects Fund. So they are very much involved, very much at the table negotiating budgets and program narratives, which is, a blessing and a curse. It's taking a little bit longer for these things to get approved, but once they're approved, you have that definitive stamp from Treasury that they have okayed the activities and the budgets, which is, for many of us, having that certainty right now is nice to have. From what I have seen, there's quite a bit of back and forth questions and negotiations with the program plan, with Treasury prioritizing their review of programs that appear to be the most straightforward and easiest to approve. So they're not approving them in, as submitted order or chronological order. They're doing an initial vetting and things that are very straightforward, middle mile projects, last mile connectivity projects. They're approving those first, and things that might be a little more complicated, have a little bit more detail, they're holding those to the end. Next slide. So similar to my earlier comments, the more you know about the ultimate compliance requirements, the better, and the more you can be identifying projects that might be in alignment and know what you're getting yourself into when your state ultimately passes through the dollars to locals. Next slide. So many jurisdictions are considering the use of fiscal recovery funds for infrastructure projects such as broadband, because compliance requirements like Buy American, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and Davis-Bacon do not apply. They see this as an opportunity to keep the cost down on projects or to expedite projects because these items oftentimes take a considerable amount of time to negotiate. Like the fiscal recovery funds, those same items do not apply to the capital projects fund. So NEPA doesn't apply. While strong labor standards do apply, Davis-Bacon in particular does not. The specific Buy American provisions that are in the IIJA don't apply. It's just the domestic preference requirement from the uniform guidance. So unless you're going to braid this funding with other federal programs like Community Development Block Grant or IIJA funds, those requirements do not apply. So the same thought process you might be having for the ARPA funds, we should use them for infrastructure because we can move the money quickly without some of these administrative strings. That same thought process would apply to the capital projects fund, unlike maybe the IIJA funding, which is coming later. For those of you who are located in states that have been less than forthcoming with information about the capital projects fund, the first major reporting milestone is coming up on October 31st. Which should be informative about what, if any, activities have occurred or are planned to occur in your state. So there is quite a bit of information on the Treasury website, quite a bit of information on State Office of Broadband Development websites, but there's certainly some information gaps out there. And having this Treasury reporting on October 31st will certainly be helpful in trying to track down some of the loose ends. Next slide. So unlike the fiscal recovery funds, where most states and local governments receive their first tranche of funding on or about the same time, as I mentioned, the capital projects fund approvals have been occurring on a rolling basis. I wish I could provide everyone on this call with a specific update of where their state is in the process or a hard date when action must take place, but it's just not possible to do with the CPF program other than this September 2022 deadline that I mentioned. On the next several slides, we'll provide some updates on the states we know and give you a sense of sort of the timing in the process. This next slide. So Treasury announced awards to the first 4 states on June 7th. These awards relate to individual program plans and not necessarily the entire allocation or the entire grant plan to a state. The first 4 states to receive awards were Louisiana, New Hampshire, Virginia, and West Virginia. For those municipalities located in these states, you should have already seen a pass-through funding opportunity either for local governments or for service providers in your community, such as this one from the state of Louisiana shown. Or you should be looking for those pass-through opportunities to be released very quickly. Again, these early announcements may or may not represent the total state allocation. In the Louisiana example here, it is the entire CPF allocation. So Louisiana qualified for $176 million. That entire amount was approved by Treasury, and they have since turned around and put it out in a program to local governments and service providers. Next slide. A second example is from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and similar to Louisiana, a pass-through funding opportunity has already been released. Virginia's approval from Treasury also comprised its total CPF allocation from Treasury of $220 million. So you can see how the $100 million minimum allocation to a state can easily double or triple based on those other factors. On July 14th, Treasury also announced 4 additional awards: Kansas, Maine, Maryland, and Minnesota. Kansas, again, is an example of where only 2/3 of its allocation have been approved. So they qualified for about $143 million, and to date, only about $88 million of it has been approved. But for what has been approved, they have already released a pass-through grant opportunity for that portion. The most recent awards, which occurred on August 30th for the states of Arkansas, Connecticut, Indiana, and Nebraska. So still a relatively small sample of states have had their initial allocations approved. But the takeaway from this slide is if your state has been announced, look for that pass-through funding opportunity, try and find out what the timing is, make sure you're prepared, make sure your community stakeholders and service providers are prepared. If your state has not been announced, inquire with your state agency as to the status of the state plan. Is it still under development, or is it with Treasury waiting for their review and approval? And see if there are still opportunities to help influence that plan, either at the larger grant plan level or at the lower project plan level. Next slide. So the entire purpose of this webinar was to inform municipalities about what you can do now. Following the federal funding is critical from initial program announcement to allocation to the state and ultimately pass through opportunities to locals. As I mentioned earlier, too often local governments wait until they see a funding opportunity announced by the state. And that's really too late to influence funding priorities, identify suitable projects, and develop quality applications. You really need to be ahead of the curve, be thinking proactively, and tracking the funding, no differently than your state agency would be tracking the funding. Next slide. So what can you do now? First and foremost, be grant ready. Know who's going to take the lead. Know what the team is comprised of. Do you have somebody from the budget side who's going to help develop that? Who's going to drive the application? Do you have the systems, policies, and procedures internally to be grant ready to go after this and other funding opportunities? Develop necessary technical information related to broadband. So make sure you have your community's use case for why you should be funded. That use case might be past performance, it might be economic development, it might be education, whatever it is, know your why and be able to communicate your why of why an investment should occur within your community. Be thinking about the return on investment, either the return on investment for the state or the return on investment for local service providers. How many additional households would be connected because of your program? How many additional users will be able to access broadband? How will you make it more sustainable, more affordable? Be thinking through that because that's all going to be built into this program. In a similar vein, know what those key performance indicators are, either from other projects you've done or looking at other communities to make sure you have those in place and they're well thought out. Take a look at adoption rates. Lots of communities, they just, say we need more broadband, more high-speed broadband, but really look at adoption rates and in particular at existing broadband programs. So look at things like your K-12 institutions and libraries, and are they taking advantage of E-rate? Are your citizens taking advantage of the affordable connectivity program that is out there right now? That all factors into this use case that you would make to either Treasury or to your state broadband office. Look what our community has already done. Look how we're already taking advantage of these programs. We just need this extra little bit of financial support to get, to do the next step. But the more you can have that data collected and really make that argument, it's critical, especially at a time where we're seeing real significant adoption problems with these programs. The affordable connectivity program in particular is at like a 20 to 30% adoption rate. So if your community can show how you have marketed it, really gotten out in front of it and are showing adoption, that really goes to your sales pitch to your state broadband office. With all of the funding that's out there right now, whether that be through ARPA, like the Capital Projects Fund, or what's coming down the pike with the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act, be thinking through your equity framework for your community. and how this investment of broadband dollars would fit into that equity framework. Those are important, critical conversations you need to be having right now, and will certainly factor into this and other funding. In a similar vein, resiliency. So if you're doing a backhaul project, if you're doing a middle mile project, if it's a last mile, how does that help with community resiliency, providing redundant service, providing other opportunities for connectivity. If service goes out, in one part of your city because of this program, individuals can go use Wi-Fi hotspots on the other side of the city, at the library, at the community park. Look at that, resiliency from a community-wide perspective. And then finally, with all federal grant program, look at sustainability. How are you going to continue this initiative going forward once the pass-through funding dries up? And how are you going to sustain this effort? Also, spend some time looking at braiding of funding opportunities and capital stacks. Look at your still available fiscal recovery funds as potential match or leverage funding requirements, either for a capital projects fund pass-through program or for the future IIJA funding. You have an opportunity right now through revenue loss provision of government services to tag some of your fiscal recovery fund as a source of match. So really look at that opportunity, and if you're going to need it either with your state or for a future federal program. What are your local service providers and other community stakeholders prepared to bring to the table? What resources are they bringing, whether that be financial, planning resources, sustainability resources? Those are conversations, as many of you know, you can't have in sort of the 2 to 3 week run up when your application actually has to be developed and submitted. Those are conversations you need to be having now, so you can get in front of them. Oftentimes, those relationships require memorandums of understanding, NDAs, other types of legal document, and it really takes some time to get those in place. So whether it's for the Capital Projects Fund or future IIJ funding, really be working on that now. And then also look at your projects. Everybody wants to fund, a single project with a single grant. They have a $5 million need, a $5 million project, and they want to find, the perfect $5 million grant that'll fund 100% of that project. That's not really the reality of grants management, as many of you know. So can you nibble around the edges of a project, or is it an all or nothing proposition? If it is an all or nothing proposition, and you might be able to get partial funding from your state and local fiscal recovery fund and partial funding from Capital Projects Fund, do you have to leverage bond revenues or other sources of funding to complete the whole picture? So really look at that, that capital stack, what all resources you're going to have to put into to complete the project. Next slide. So these are just some helpful links we wanted to provide. We will also be working with Bloomberg to send out a couple other documents, one being some information about the affordable, the connectivity program. Another one is we will take the Treasury Capital Projects Fund guidance and actually distill it down into a one-pager for you. We know you're all really busy, so we'll just give you the highlights so you don't have to read through it. The good news is it's not as long as the final rule for the state and local fiscal recovery fund, but it's still fairly lengthy, and we'll try and save you that time. But what we have here is the overall guidance document, FAQs, which we've all found to be, almost more helpful than the actual guidance because it provides the proper context to our questions. The individual allocations for states, so you can see what the opportunity is for your particular state, and then just some other resources related to preparing for and going after broadband funding, whether that be just general programs or specific initiatives that are in the bipartisan infrastructure law or the IIJA. Jamie, was there anything else about these resources you wanted to add?
No, it just that as I put in the chat, we'll be circulating the deck with these links live, since you can't click on a screen share. I also put into the chat the listing of the state broadband offices that Matt referenced earlier, and a link to treasury.gov's site dedicated to the capital projects funds. For those states where awards have already been made, you'll see a link with information and a press release about the award. One question, I think, Matt, that I've seen popping up in the chat a bit is for states maybe where the award hasn't been made yet, is there a way to see what the state submitted?
Not that I'm aware of. That's really an opportunity or a reason to engage with the state broadband office and to see if they posted a draft version or see if you can get a copy of it. But I have not found where Treasury or anybody else has posted the sort of submitted but not yet approved plans.
Yeah, and I was looking while you were talking for Texas's plan, for instance, and I think it's a little bit of a Google black hole. And so I would maybe encourage that old-fashioned pick up the phone and talk to somebody, because you might want to spend a couple of days trying to find it on the internet.
I really wish that this was a funding opportunity where local governments could apply directly, but I think most of you are really used to kind of the world of pass-through and subrecipient opportunities. But this one is a big deal, and it's a big deal at a time when there's lots of funding available or potentially available for broadband. So it's one we did not want you to just overlook. We didn't want you to go straight from fiscal recovery fund, are we going to make any investments in broadband with that funding, immediately to what's available in the IIJA without taking a careful look at the capital projects fund and see if there might be an opportunity for you there. I know, and I apologize for keep using Kansas as an example, but we do some work there. Their program that they've already released, they've gotten, I believe it's almost 200 applications for funding. And the program is significantly oversubscribed, which is a bad thing, but also a good thing, because it allows the Office of Broadband Development to advocate for additional funding for service providers and local governments. So it gives them that hard data set to go back to the state legislature, those who are still making investment decisions about remaining fiscal recovery fund, but also to go to the feds and say, here is the real need, the documented need, not a plan, not a hypothetical, but an actual documented need, and communicate that out. So really encourage you to, pursue these pass-through funding opportunities, but more importantly, have those conversations with your state leaders and in particular, offices of broadband development. And with that, I think we can open it up for some questions.
Great, and please continue to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll invite you to ask your question live to Matt. One question that came in, Matt, was about how to think about those different programs that are eligible to fund broadband activities. So we have some IJA funding, again, through the states, largely, other than middle mile. We have ARPA, SLFRF funds, and we have capital project funds. Are there differences in the eligible uses there, or could you conceive of a plan where they're sort of fungible between the different uses?
There are, so the IIJ funds tend to be more project specific, sector specific, focusing on just middle mile activities or just long haul activities. The state and local fiscal recovery funds and the capital projects funds appear to be sort of the most fungible that you could do, a wide variety of projects. One of the key items is really about timelines. I mean, we're talking about capital projects. If you're running fiber, if you're running underground fiber, if you're running fiber on overhead electric lines, these are things where you'll have to get easements and other approvals. So there's a timing perspective. So while you have your state and local fiscal recovery funds and potentially the CPF funds, are you going to be able to get all of those approvals and get the projects done by 2026? We would hope, especially with the Capital Projects Fund, that Treasury will ultimately issue some sort of extension, but we don't know that at this point. So it might be a case where, depending on the complexity of the project, you're really forced to look to the infrastructure bill for funding versus these other two funding sources. But if it's a project that has, there's a fiber component, there's a Wi-Fi component, there's devices, there's a connectivity, the more sort of variables you have to a project, the more likely that your state and local fiscal recovery or your capital projects fund would be an easier funding source instead of trying to fit it into one of the IIJ programs.
Great. Another question that's come in is, and I think you spoke to this a little bit in terms of, sort of doing a lot of the work to exhaust other funding programs, right? Getting information about the Affordable Connections program out into your communities is a persuasive way to say we're doing everything we can, right? What are other ways that you think to make a compelling case and develop a compelling project plan that might move the needle with your state to get that funded?
We've already started to see with the IIJ programs is a reliance on mapping. The mapping really doesn't tell the story. One of the maps they'll put out says you have, 7 service providers in your community. And when you dig down deeper into the data, those, 7 service providers, either serve a very limited portion of your community, or they're still not providing the speed requirements, or in many cases, they're either unaffordable, non-attainable for most residents of your community, or they are significantly unreliable. So spending some time looking at the data that NTIA and others have put out, the maps, and really, sort of pulling that data apart and being able to communicate what's actually happening in your community is important. Also to be able to, sort of have a catalog of what you have already done. So investments you've made over the years, investments that your service providers, partners have made. So we're not just showing up today because there's this influx of money. We've been working on this for some time. Here are the steps we've taken. Here are the brick walls we've run into, and this is why we're coming for this funding to help get past those obstacles. So those are 2 items I would certainly recommend.
Great, and we've gotten a question from Peter Mahuk. Hopefully I'm not mispronouncing that. Peter, are you available to come on camera and ask your question? Otherwise I can ask it for you. All right, well, I'll get started and Peter can add color if I've missed anything. He's asking about rural or suburban customers that have homes set back from the right of way where the line will be buried, say 100 yards or more. Are the ISP providers going to be required to lay the fiber cable on private property and connect to the home? Middle mile and last mile get talked about a lot. What about last 100 feet, 200 feet?
Yeah, it's a critical issue, especially in rural America. It's going to be state by state, program by program decisions. I don't have a good answer for you, but certainly the goals are 100% connectivity of every household. In reality, that's not doable. You're not going to run a last mile fiber line down a 10-mile farm road to connect one customer. I mean, it's cost prohibitive. So it's going to be a kind of an all the above strategy. Where does fiber fit? Where does wireless? Where does satellite? Where does connecting anchor institutions versus connecting individual homes? All of those are going to have to be factored into this. So those ideas, especially in rural America, are key conversations that need to happen to make sure everybody has access to broadband.
That's great. And another question that had come in was about engaging the community here. Where do you see, I know that that's a big focus area for IJA funds, is showing in applications that you've done that community engagement piece. Where do you see that playing in capital projects funds? And is it a funding criteria?
It is a critical component of any and all federal grant funding at this point, whether it's passed through or not, is to do stakeholder engagement. Even where there's not a specific requirement to do stakeholder engagement, it will come across loud and clear in your proposal if that step has not taken place. We talked earlier about equity frameworks and resiliency. While there are some national definitions, some national language around equity and resiliency, it's also critical to know what that means to your community. So, equity can mean, older housing stock. It can mean lack of access to primary health care. It can mean food deserts. It can mean a lot of things other than just economic or social equity. While those are critically important, and addressing historically and disproportionately impacted communities is a principle of all of these programs, that equity definition goes much further than that. And the only way you're going to really understand that for your community is through stakeholder engagement. Same thing with resiliency. Certainly there's climate change as resiliency, but as we've seen with the recent COVID public health pandemic, resiliency is also loss of a major employer, loss of a key piece of infrastructure. It could be, a shutdown of a local community college or job training program. It's, how would your community move forward due to an obstacle? And in broadband, it's, things like redundant paths of fiber and other things. So you're really only going to, get these answers through stakeholder engagement. You should be doing it early and often, and not necessarily tied to this particular funding opportunity or another particular funding opportunity. The other thing I will say is you don't do it one time. Community engagement has to be an ongoing process. The jurisdictions who are really good at pursuing grants have ongoing conversations with their communities, find out what priorities are. But what else also comes out of that is key stakeholders, places where maybe the city is not eligible for funding, but through a stakeholder engagement, you find out that the local community college might be eligible, or a nonprofit organization might be eligible. You will run into these programs where you do have to have multiple partners. And as I mentioned before, you don't work through MOUs and those agreements, at the last minute. And that comes out of this regular community engagement. Certainly, not just in the context of Capital Projects Fund or the IIJA, but I encourage you to have, open and active and continuous community engagement wherever possible.
Thanks, Matt. We have a question, it looks like, from Louis Tobias. I think that's Rochester, New York's backdrop, but Louis, you want to come off mute?
Sure, it is. As it relates to the affordability with respect to connectivity, how do you do you have any experience or any suggestions? One of the problems that we know that we're dealing with here is that once we inform our citizenry of the availability of the programs, when they go to sign up, they're not necessarily digitally savvy. So they'll call the provider and say, hey, I want to sign up for your $14.95 a month program or your $9.95 a month program. And the first question that they're asked is, well, are you going to be surfing the internet? And the answer is yes. And they're like, well, I don't know if that's going to work for you. And then they get the upsell, and then they get to the point where, well, I can't afford $70 a month, so never mind. And anybody else experiencing that, anybody else dealing with that, trying to figure out how, because, of course, the provider is providing the exact same service at $14.95 that they are at $79.95, but, if they can get the person to sign up for the, make the extra $60 apart. So how do you suggest we deal with that?
I hopefully somebody from one of the other municipalities has some ideas. Somebody already put in chat, the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP, is one of those things. Certainly, the administration in the last couple of years has made this a priority and made a requirement for these service providers. If you're going to receive a portion of these federal funding, you have to participate in this program. But to your point, that doesn't change the behaviors that happen in the store, when they're signing up for these services. So I think it's really critical to, get that feedback, provide an opportunity for your citizens to provide that feedback to you, so that when you're, selecting provider partners going forward, that can be part of the conversation. Other than that, I don't have a great answer for you, but even for those of us that might be able to afford a little bit more in internet connectivity, we go through the same, we walked in and we thought it was going to be one price, and we walk out and it's, double or triple what we thought it was going to be.
Yeah, and I think we've seen in the chat a few different ways, including one from a neighbor in Syracuse about digital navigators and where they can maybe play a role. But again, like you said, if someone's walking into the store, that might be hard. So how do you even change the consumer behavior to deal with the digital navigator? I don't know if Jen or John, if you'd be willing to share how you've implemented those digital navigators in your community.
Yeah, this is John from City of Seattle. I mean, it's all kind of in process and developing kind of as we go. But I would say as a real quick answer, identifying trusted partners and trusted advocates and community members to do the work is one really important way, so that the potential clients, customers are working with someone that they already know and trust.
Great. Jen, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I would echo that. This is Jen Tipp from the City of Syracuse. So we literally just launched our program in collaboration with our community center network. Again, trying to really make this very neighborhood based, very much about those community organizations we know are already working with the really hard to serve populations and are trusted by them. But I think part of why we in Syracuse have kind of come to a conclusion that we want to maybe pursue a municipal network to provide service directly to lower income families in particular is because of the issue that Louis is bringing up. Upstate New York, I think we have some very similar challenges, essentially a single, in many cases, internet provider. So if that, if that customer is going to them directly and, getting the upsell and not sure what to do, it really puts communities like ours at a disadvantage where, we feel like we're kind of at this, damned if we do, damned if we don't situation where, a muni network might be the only good option to ensure folks really get affordable service at this point, because we just don't have a lot of competitors. So, people really are at the mercy of, single private sector providers in many cases, which just means, these capital funding programs are just so critical for communities like ours.
Can I just clarify my comment, just so everybody understands that we have those programs, we have those providers, and when we have a motivated client that says, no, they told me to come in and sign up for this one, and this is the only one I'm signing up for, they get signed up, everything goes fine, and everything is great. The problem is that when you get the 65-year-old grandmother going in signing up because she's got a 14-year-old that needs to do homework, and they're told, well, I don't know if that program is going to work for what your little Johnny needs, that's when we really do have some problems. And I understand the navigators, but almost we have to send the navigators into the store with every customer. So.
Yeah, well, thank you all for sharing. And also, the mayor of Mesa, Arizona, in our recent local infrastructure hub webinar on broadband, shared how he'd worked to bring more providers into the space and create a competitive landscape so that maybe, competition in the market help here. But hear you, Louis, on the challenges. Thank you so much, Matt. We're going to just launch a poll to get some feedback from you all, if you wouldn't mind filling it out. And while you're filling it out, I will pass it to Rose to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the information that you've passed on and your experience. And we hope that everybody can draw from it and also take a look at the materials that have been shared and posted, and we'll go on the website following the program. And speaking of the ongoing work of this program, as we alluded to in the beginning, there are a couple of additional workshops that may be of interest to you folks. On September 27th, we are doing a workshop on FEMA's BRIC program. On September 29th, we're doing a program on navigating federal grants and building community capacity. And October 12th, we're doing a workshop on revisiting pandemic compliance lessons to prepare for ongoing and future obstacles. So 3 new topics on the horizon for you to take advantage of. Thank you all for coming. Jamie, are there any other points of interest or mechanics that we should lift up for the folks before we say goodbye?
Yeah, for those of you who have stayed on till the end, we'd invite you to stay on with us and let us know whether or not you would like to schedule a one-on-one session with our experts like Matt to talk either about broadband or about other areas of the federal funding where you're having some concern. So you can always email us to request a one-on-one at COVID e311 at bloomberg.org, and I'll put that in the chat. But you can also, if you'd like, stay on with us right now. Everyone else can drop off and let us know and give us your topic. And our team at Bennett Midland, who's been helping us on all things implementation, will be here to collect your feedback, and then we can work to bring that forth. Seeing the request for a one-on-one, we'll conclude, and feel free to email us if you'd like to schedule one. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh, yeah, please.
Is it possible to get an attendee list?
I can share out with you people who participated in and had the ideas about the different programs, if that's helpful.
Yes, because or at least publish the chat.
Yeah, I can share with you information to reach, Jen and John and the others who had some ideas for programs that might deal with some of those upsell challenges.
Okay, all right, because like there were a couple of comments
Yeah.
from Syracuse and Detroit and Seattle, and there's some those are some people I probably need to connect with over the
Absolutely.
Upcoming months. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everyone.